Well, let's get back to our discussion that we were talking about. Here's our review session. Look at that. That's nice, isn't it? We've done all this. Well, I think we maybe ended here. No, this one right here. Okay, so basically what we've been talking about in the aftermath of World War I, there is devastation across Europe. You know, the United States has been spared, for the most part, warfare. The only extended battles the United States have fought on their own land here has been the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. But other than that, we've really been spared. Yes, there was Pearl Harbor, which was devastating to our Navy, but that was really one day. There was 9/11. Perhaps many of you don't remember it. That was devastating, but that was one day. But imagine if you had that every day for months or years. Imagine how that would destroy buildings and lives and farms and, resources and bridges and roads. World War I devastated France and, to a large measure, Germany and many other places across the continent of Europe. So the economy was such that Germany was forced, at the end of the war, the agreement that they had to sign, the agreement that they did sign, said that they were taking the blame for the entire war and that they were going to pay war reparations. It's important to know that that was signed by a new government. The Kaiser of Germany, the guy who had sort of encouraged the war, resigned. He abdicated the throne before the surrender. So a fledgling government signed that agreement. That's important to remember. Because I can tell you somebody who's going to point that out over and over again is going to be a guy named Adolf Hitler. And he's going to say that this new government sold out the Germans with this signing this and these terrible reparations. Well, at any rate, Germans need money. The United States is flush with cash because they came out of the war in pretty good shape. And so they begin to loan the money. Banks begin to loan the money, as we said last time. But eventually, people get nervous and the stock market crashes and everything falls out from there. So the United States begins calling in the loans that they've given, especially to Germany and others. There's a panic in the United States. There's a run on the bank. Everybody wants their money out. And as we've already said, the banks don't keep a huge vault full of all the money you give them, assuming you give them any money. Their vaults have a limited amount of cash in them. So if everybody, like even today, if everybody went down to the same bank and wanted all their money out of that bank, of course now we have branches of banks, so we got huge banks, but still, they wouldn't be able to give it all to you. They'd have to say, you have to come back tomorrow or whatever. And if that happened all over the country, even a huge bank could collapse. In fact, we had some large financial institutions collapse and others were bailed out a few years ago, about 10 years ago. Anyway, so the depression begins to grow. And I think we did have this one up too the last time. But I just wanted to point out this picture because I don't think I said anything about it. Here is a guy. I don't know if you can see it clearly. He has his hat right here. You see that? And he's clearly distressed. He's begging, and he doesn't like it. So he's hiding his face. But this is what he's forced to do. Because banks close, jobs shut down, factories close. How's this guy going to feed his family? How's he going to eat? So on. So that's what he's doing. So the response that we began to talk about last time, and maybe just got to the first couple of these, I think is where we were. Some people begin to say, well, maybe Karl Marx was right. Maybe capitalism doesn't work. That sort of thing. So that begins to grow. And if they don't go fully committed to all the tenets of Marxism, they begin to pick up the Marxist ideas, or they sometimes call them socialist ideas, but they're really similar, right? This guy right here, John Maynard Keynes, he's a British economist, teaches at Cambridge. He writes a work that you see listed here and see him pictured here, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money in 1936. This is in the midst of the Great Depression this is written. Now, what many people, what was commonly held at the time, which he will not hold to, what was a common theory was to follow the principles of Adam Smith. I think we mentioned Adam Smith in passing before in here, certainly in your textbook. Adam Smith is a British, well, I guess you call him economist, a theorist, philosopher of sorts. What does Adam Smith say? Anybody know what Adam Smith is famous for or anything about him? The British? I guess I'll ask questions. Maybe that will engage you more. He wrote a book called The Wealth of the Nations. Oh, that's what you were going to say? He did, yeah, he wrote probably more than one, but that's his most famous one, The Wealth of the Nations. Well, basically what he's going to say, you remember we were talking about, like with the scientific revolution and everybody, enlightenment, everybody had all these rules, and they said the universe was, we had all these rules about how the universe works, all the laws that were there, laws of motion and so forth. Well, the common idea is that there were laws that then extended to other things, to our society and to the economy. So, Adam Smith will write that the economy should be left alone. Remember we talked about laissez-faire economics. You should leave it alone. Keep your hands off. Don't play around with it. Don't try to adjust it in some way. All right? It will naturally balance and come to equilibrium. And the more that we try to alter it, the more we'll probably mess it up. I'm paraphrasing greatly, but that's the idea. So the idea here was, if we have this Great Depression or we have this economic downturn, what should we do? Basically, many people said, don't do anything. The depression, the economic depression, or we like to call them now recessions, because a recession is supposed to be less than a depression. Nobody wants to use that term depression anymore. Okay, but the economic downturn will be self-correcting. That was the idea. So, for example, if the stocks go way down, that meant that they were too high. They were artificially high. They will adjust to a level. They probably will then go way down, but then they'll edge their way back up, probably not to what they were, but there will be an adjustment, right? Or if goods, for example, perhaps there's too many goods. Maybe I think what somebody who would follow Adam Smith's teaching, free market, free enterprise kind of thing, would say, you know what? We were overspending. We were taking great risk in loaning all this money to the Germans, whose economy was terrible. And everybody had this sort of fever that everything was just going to grow, is sort of drunk of the 1920s, partying in the 1920s. Everybody thought it would never stop. And then suddenly it crashes. I said, it will adjust. It will come back. All right. Enter this guy, John Maynard Keynes, and that becomes a policy that we still follow today, even though we don't talk about it too much. Because prior to this, governments tried to run their economy the way you have to sort of run your economy, even though that's changed as well, too. So, for example, let's say you make $50,000 in a year, and you are spending $70,000 in a year. Obviously, you're spending more than you're making, right? So that means to do that, you go $20,000 in debt. Then if you do it the next year and the next year and the next year, Your debt just keeps growing. Besides, when you go into debt, then you're being charged interest on the debt. So governments tried to have a balance of their budget, that they would spend no more than what they took in. That goes out the window in the Depression. That goes out the window with this kind of teaching. What he teaches is that the government should intervene and that the government should use deficit spending. What does that mean? That means spending money you don't have. I guess today we call it a credit card. Right? You want that new iPhone or you want whatever, and you don't have the money for it. Well, I'm not going to wait, because if I wait 6 months to buy the new iPhone, it won't be new anymore. And it'll actually be cheaper. I'm going to buy it right now when it's more expensive, so that I can show all my friends that I have the latest phone. Or whatever. Okay, whatever your rationale is. You don't have the money, but what's happened is that credit now has, now all the way down to college students, a whole bunch of people have credit cards. It used to be a credit card was a rare thing. And a lot of people didn't want to use them. And in fact, they had to really encourage people to get them. Today, nobody cares. A lot of people have 4 or 5 credit cards or more. Right? Now, so I think we have personal deficit spending. We have all kinds of loans, credit card debt, student loans, house loans, so forth. So, all right, so obviously something like some debt is okay, but the government begins to spend lots of money they don't have, which means they're going to have to pay it back or not, and they're going to have to then pay it back with interest. If they default on it, well, then the entire economy of the country is. And right now, I don't even know what it is. I don't want to know, because it's too depressing how many trillions of dollars the United States government is in debt. We constantly spend more money than we take in. It's just routine. Nobody even thinks about it anymore. Yeah, put that in the budget, put this in the budget. We'll spend this or that. The government's got the money, they'll do it. The government really doesn't have the money. And here's a little reminder. There's only one way governments get money. That's from you and me. Taxes. That's how they get money. It's the only way governments get money. They don't sell anything, right? They're not making a profit on selling you things. They just spend. So where do they get the money to spend? Well, bottom line is they spend more than they get. But the money that they do get, they're getting it from us, taxpayers, in various ways. You got taxes on your income, so when you get your paycheck, they take money out there. If you go to the store and buy stuff, they take money out there. For example, if you need tires on a car, just to give you one example, you will go and buy your tires, right? And then you will pay tax on your tires. So your tire is $100. You'll pay whatever it is here now, 7% or something, or whatever the sales tax is. But guess what? Built into the tire, there's already tax. They figure if you're buying a tire, you're getting rid of a tire, so they pay you for a tire disposal fee. They also pay you a highway tax fee. All that stuff, because they figure you got a tire, you're going to drive it on the roads, you're going to wear out the roads, so we give you a tax. So built into that $100 for your tires, I don't know how much it is, but I would say at least 10% of it is taxes and fees that go to the government. Plus on top of that, sales tax. So actually, I believe, and I might be wrong on this, but I believe you're paying sales tax on other taxes. You'll still pay your sales tax on that extra 10% tax that's built into your tire. When you go to the pump and you pump out a gallon of gas, and it says now, what is it, like $2.50, 40 cents, it's hovering, it's moving around in there. But again, I'd have to check here in Florida, but I'm confident that over 50 cents of that, 60 cents of that on every gallon is tax. If they gave you the gas for free, you'd still be paying like 75 cents a gallon, 60 to 75 cents a gallon. If the guy just said, here, you can have that, but you got to pay the taxes. At least they don't charge a sales tax on the gallon of gas. I guess I shouldn't say that out loud. It might give somebody an idea. You should add in an extra 6 or 7%. Well, that's deficit spending. So governments need money, and they're spending more than they have. The idea that Keyes has is that you spend the money that you don't have, and that's going to artificially then put people to work. So we're going to say, okay, we're going to go out here, we're going to build some roads. And this is what they did. Or we're going to go out into the wilderness, and we're going to create a park, and we're going to hire a bunch of people to go out and create trails out there and build like little sheds for people to rest at and stuff, And we'll just, we're going to pump money into building trails, paying people to clear the trails. We're going to build new bridges, new roads. We're going to go out and build schools or whatever. We're just going to build things, government buildings, and that's going to put people to work. And we're not going to pay for it right now. We're going to let it ride. That will then, the idea was, stimulate the economy, and when people get back to work, then we can charge them more taxes and we'll pay all of it back. Well, we never have really paid it all back. There's some question whether this is a big question, even today, when we talk about the differences between liberals and conservatives, or I guess increasingly Democrats and Republicans, although, it used to be there were conservative Democrats and there were liberal Republicans, but now I don't know. You got to watch the labels. But if you're an economic liberal today, whatever your party affiliation, then you're far more for deficit spending, whether you realize it or not. You want a lot of government programs. You want to spend a lot of money. And if somebody says, well, how are you going to pay for that? Then, well, wait a minute, you must be an economic conservative because you're worried about how you're going to pay for all these programs. Well, this is where it all starts, the Great Depression. We start spending more and more that we don't have with the idea we're going to pay it back someday. And we are now trillions and I don't know what's more than a trillion. We're going to hit it pretty soon. Gazillion? No, I guess that's not the right. Anyway, we are way in debt. And we think up new ways to get money, but we spend that too, like, say, Social Security. We start putting that money into the kitty as well. That sort of be like taking your retirement money and spending it. I can tell you this about Social Security. This is all I'll say, then I'll move on. That if private businesses dealt with the retirement money that they take in from their employees the way the federal government deals with the money that they take in from the people that pay them for retirement, they would go to prison. Because you're not supposed to touch people's retirement money and pull it out of there and invest it or spend it or put it in to balance your budget. And we're going to put it back in later. That's against the law. But the government does it regularly, so I guess maybe it's not against the law for them. At any rate, the Great Depression gets really, really bad. Certainly Germany is the one that's hit the hardest. Germany had a lot to rebuild. Germany was greatly in debt even before all of this. And they are industrialized, so basically, remember, France has already taken over some of their most profitable factories, and so they have high unemployment. 3 million people unemployed March 1930. By December of 1930, so, 7 months later, 8 months later, it's now 4.38 million. So, here I show a picture of President von Hindenburg. You might remember him. He was one of the war heroes of Germany. And so this new government that has been put into place is called the Weimar Republic. Remember, the Kaiser has resigned. And so now we have the Weimar Republic, which is a kind of democratically elected, I guess. It's supposed to be a democracy. But again, it's quite weak. But they have somebody like von Hindenburg as their president. He's, because he's very popular. Right? He's a popular war hero. Don't know how well equipped he is to be running Germany, especially in this economic hard times. But remember, the Weimar Republic, they get blamed. They get blamed by a lot of people, but Adolf Hitler's going to pick up on it, and he's really going to blame them. And you know what he's going to say? The Weimar Republic in its administration has lots of Jewish people. Okay, so this is exactly where he's going to go with that, racial anti-Semitism. Okay, let's move on. How about in the United States, the good old US of A? Now, here, you know, sometimes I like to find these political cartoons. I kind of like this one, but it's a little disturbing if you really think about it. Because, take a look, here you got, I assume, Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam is a symbol of the United States, all right? And he's sitting in a comfortable chair, but he's got on his slippers and his socks. He's obviously sick. Look at all these bottles of medicine he's got. Uncle Sam's under the weather. And then you've got FDR. He's coming in as the doctor with the remedies, see? The New Deal remedies. And he says, of course, we may have to change remedies if we don't get results. Now, here's the part that I find very disturbing, is that Uncle Sam is married to Uncle Sam. I'm assuming that's Mrs. Uncle Sam, but Mrs. Uncle Sam has a goatee. And I don't know, it looks like Uncle Sam to me with a dress. So anyway, I don't like to think about that. But that's, so basically then, FDR, you know, doctors used to actually come to your house, make house calls. I know, it's hard to believe, isn't it? You would call up the doctor, and the doctor, you know, would go around in a car or whatever, or buggy even before that, and they would go from house to house and visit you. Take your temperature. They'd have a bag like this, you know, with remedies and, you know, things to listen, stethoscopes and so forth, and they would make a house call. It's almost unheard of now. Nobody does it now. But that's the way it used to be. So that's what this is. FDR's making a house call. He's the doctor. He's the economic doctor. And Uncle Sam's problems are obviously economic. Now, if you look very carefully on the table here of medicines or remedies, you're going to see a lot of letters here. These are part of FDR's, what many people called his alphabet soup kind of programs, right? He had all sorts of things, and he just would go by the letters. So he's got here the CCC. That's a Civilian Conservation Corps. Those are the guys that go out and build trails and parks and that kind of stuff. This one was very controversial, the NRA, not the National Rifle Association, but the National Recovery Act, which, by the way, was later deemed unconstitutional and had to be done away with. So a lot of people in Congress didn't really like what FDR was doing. Can't imagine Congress and the president not seeing eye to eye, can you? Well, at any rate, the United States was hit pretty hard. 15 million unemployed in 1933. And this is what brings then in FDR, as he's called, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, not to be confused with his cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, who was president some 35 years earlier. He ran on the idea of the New Deal, and that's why his bag says New Deal remedies. And he has bought into Keynes' idea of deficit spending. And so that's what all these bottles are with all the letters on them. We won't go through them all, but it's basically just creating jobs, creating work, creating things for people to do. Some of it useful, some of it maybe not as useful. But the main goal was not necessarily to be useful, but to put people to work and to pay them. So the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, was actually put into place. That's the big bottle here with the eagle on it. That was put into place to regulate industry. This is something that Roosevelt put into place, which basically is going to tell factories what they could make and how much of it they could make, and so on. So, you've got a factory where you used to make tractors, but now we want you to make cars or whatever else we want you to make. You're going to do basically the government. It's kind of a government oversight, some would say takeover, of industry. This was declared unconstitutional in 1935. 1935. And so FDR is fully committed, though, to deficit spending, and that's what he does. So there is a debate. Some people say what he did, brought us out of the Great Depression. Other people argue that no, actually what he did not bring us out of the Great Depression. What brought us out of the Great Depression was World War II. World War II, we had a massive amount of stuff we needed to do militarily, and that got our economy going. Put everybody to work, put a bunch of people in the military, put a lot of people in the factories. And after World War II, we have a real boom of our economy in the late 40s, 1950s, into the early 1960s. Things are really booming in the United States, economically speaking. Well, one thing that is created under FDR, and here's an actual picture of FDR, signing the Social Security Act of 1935. He had to come up with a second New Deal. That's kind of a modification because the one part was deemed unconstitutional, so he had to kind of work some of that. And we see that he starts a lot of public works. That's what they're called. WPA was a big one, Works Progress Administration. I remember in my hometown, which was a very small town, back in Indiana, we had sidewalks in my town that said WPA on them. They had been put into place in the 1930s, still had not been replaced. They were some of them not in very good shape. In fact, part of the school that I attended, the high school I attended, was built by the WPA. Had it right on the cornerstone of the building. It has since been torn down. But that's the kind of stuff they were doing. Sidewalks, schools, bridges, trails, all kinds of things. So that's the WPA. That was established in 1935. And what we see is the United States begins as a welfare state. There was no Social Security prior to the Social Security Act of 1935. Well, what would happen to old people without Social Security? Well, we may find out again one of these days. But I'll tell you what would happen. Their families took care of them. That's the way it worked. That's why you had grandma live with you. Or whoever, your aunt or your uncle or somebody. They would come and live with you. And you would, give them a bedroom or something, depending on how wealthy you were. You give them a bed to sleep in, you give them some food, and they'd live with you, and you kind of watch over them, help them out in their old age. But with the coming of the Social Security, in large measure, now a lot of people no longer take the responsibility for their relatives as they once did. I'll just be honest about it. They don't. They put them in a home, that kind of thing. Because why? Well, I don't want to be stuck with grandma at home. I want to go do my own thing. I don't have to worry about her. We'll put her over here. She'll like it over here better anyway, being there with people of her own age and whatever. So, I don't know what your views on that. That's up to you to think about. But I can tell you that's the way it used to be. Older relatives or people that got sick or something like that, or if a child was orphaned, a lot of the things that we look to the government to do now, it used to be the family did. If there was parents that died and there were children, those children would then be taken in by relatives, an aunt, an uncle, grandparents, or something like that. Okay. So the United States then, it becomes a welfare state where basically people increasingly think the government ought to be the ones that are paying for or taking care of people. Some say from the cradle to the grave, the government ought to be watching over you, kind of like your mother or somebody like that. Your nanny. Sometimes it's called the nanny state. So, if you're a kid and you need something, well, the government ought to pay for what you need. If you're old and you need something, the government ought to pay for that. If you get sick, then the government ought to pay for that. So this is a very different view than what it was before, and this is a pretty accepted view today. In fact, by me even pointing it out, I'm probably considered very radical and insensitive. That's all right. Because what people used to do is that churches, charities, and families helped people in need, not the government. That just wasn't the job of the government. Anyway, the Social Security Act was basically a way to get more money to the government so they could spend on these things. It was a kind of a tax. Well, they didn't call it the Social Security tax. They just called it Social Security. Because what would then happen is you would pay and people still do, you pay your tax on your wages. You have a wage tax, whatever it might be. But then there's also the Social Security tax. So that basically, depending on your status, about 25 to 30% of what you make automatically goes to the government before you ever see it. Unless you're self-employed, and then they really come after you to get it. Right? So that's just the way it is. And most of that you're never going to get back. You can file your taxes, maybe you'll get a little bit back. But even graduated income tax was fairly new. Now that was not Roosevelt, it was before Roosevelt. That was Woodrow Wilson, who started the graduated income tax, where people who were rich would pay a higher rate than people who were poor, with the idea that you're going to redistribute money from the wealthy to the poor through the government by imposing taxes. I mean, that's what the idea of the graduated income tax is. So that we have a system now today where there's a lot of people that don't pay any taxes. They file their taxes because they're going to get a refund even though they haven't paid any in. It's called earned income credit. So, let's say you get a job and you pay in your 20%. You get that 20% back, plus then you get more money than you paid in back, depending on your economic status. So it's a redistribution of funds. So that's just a very different way to think about society, family, and the role of government. Is the government supposed to take care of you? A lot of people say yes. A lot of people want it to do more, right? Anyway, there we go. Now, let's see. I think we talked about this before. So we're going to bypass this. We talked about him. So we're going to see then that World War I is going to change the world. I think I got to open up a new PowerPoint. And World War I will in fact change. We haven't spent much time in here talking about Asia or China because we're focused mostly on the West. However, increasingly as we get into the mid-20th century, what's going on in Asia is going to have more of an impact on the West. Right? Think of the Korean War, the Vietnam War, World War II. A lot of it's fought in the Pacific. So I just want to go over it a little bit today. To understand what's going on in China, China was ruled by emperors for millennia, for thousands of years. The final emperor of China comes at right about the time of World War I, early 20th century. Then China has a fledgling government that is actually a democracy or a republic. The guy who led part of this initial takeover and getting rid of the emperor is this guy pictured here, General Yuan. But the person who will become pivotal in beginning a republic in China was Sun Yat-sen. So, this will become increasingly what happens in China. And because of that, in the aftermath of World War I, the one thing we haven't talked too much about, although we did mention it in here, was the fact that the British have taken over and had a huge empire. In fact, China had been colonized by the British, by the Germans, by the Dutch. The place where Vietnam is had been colonized by France, French Indochina. So in other words, this colonialism that we've been talking about has really made its way into Asia, and that's what's going to draw Asia increasingly into the sphere of Europe for trade, economy, and even war. But if you remember, we did mention in here, I believe, the Opium War and the China being taken over by the British. This devastated. China was just devastated and weak. And all the European countries come in and take over. That made a lot of people in China upset. And many of them wanted to be independent of the Europeans. So, they saw increasingly that the emperors are weak and that they're just sort of puppets for the Europeans. And that's what led to this ending of the last emperor and then the coming of somebody like this, military General Yuan. So there is a struggle here, and we see this often, a struggle between the military and those who maybe want a democracy to get rid of the emperor, but they don't want it to be taken over by the military. So the guy who had been pushing for democracy is this guy, Sun Yat-sen. He will eventually flee China because the military takeover, and he will eventually have influence in China again. Because the other increasing power in Asia that's not European are the Japanese. And the Japanese are gaining great grounds in this part of the world. They've basically taken the model of the Europeans, imperialism, and they are now using it themselves. And Japan is building up its industry. It's becoming an imperial power. And Japan increasingly takes over territory in China. They actually fight a war against Russia that we mentioned during the Russian Revolution. We mentioned that this war, well, I guess I mentioned when I talked about World War I, that the war between Japan and Russia in like 1906. And that was the first indication to the West that Japan was a power that you're going to have to deal with. So, by basically getting Sun Yat-sen to come there, as well as they had the former emperor come there, Japan is positioning themselves to say, we are the ones who legitimately have the rulers of China, and so they start to gain more and more power. So we see then Western influence. The United States had entered into the Pacific. They had actually taken gunboats to Japan and wanted access to the harbors so we could get coal and supplies and stuff, and it was part of our control of the Pacific. And of course we had taken control of the Philippines after the Spanish-American War, which was primarily, we usually talk about it focusing in the Caribbean, places like Cuba and so forth. But, it's also in the Philippines. And so that really gets us into that position. And the United States today is more and more focused on the Pacific, and perhaps rightly so, because China has grown with a great power. economically. And so we are in the midst right now of an economic battle, I guess you might say, with China. The administration has imposed sanctions against Chinese goods. And of course, I think everyone has known for a long time that China does not follow any copyright laws or any of that sort of thing. So basically, if they get a hold of something, then they will make it, and they'll make it cheaper, and they don't come up with the ideas, a lot of them, most of the time, but they know how to duplicate the ideas and then kind of run other people out of business. Now, that could be intellectual property, like inventions and goods, music and movies and all kinds of things. And so that's what part of this is. And we have a deficit, a great trade deficit with China today. So that's part of what this is about. It seems like so there will be some talk soon. Maybe some results will come. But, you know, the general trend is that China is gaining power, Asia is gaining power, and the West is losing power. That's a general trend that people see. I think probably some truth to it. So in other words, India, China are gaining in power, while Europe and the United States are losing some power. So we see then, Western culture makes its way into China, and we see that when Yuan dies, China is in turmoil. That's the guy who was the military leader, the dictator, you might call him. When he dies, then what's going to happen? Well, there were a lot of intellectuals in Peking, which we now call Beijing, in this new cultural movement. They were bringing a lot of Western ideas in. Western ideas. Ideas about democracy and science and industrialization. But, you know, most people in China just lived their lives. They were peasants. They were working out in the fields. A lot of them couldn't read or write, didn't have time to think about such things. But the intellectuals in the cities were very much geared into this. Okay? So this is also important to know. Now, the end of World War I comes in Paris, in what's called the Paris Peace Conference. All right? The Paris Peace Conference, which takes place in 1919. That is an important meeting. And it's going to have impact, since it is a world war, it will have impact around the world. Germany, as I said at the end, you know, remember one of the deals, one of the stipulations of the treaty that the Germans signed is that they will relinquish all territories outside of the boundaries, you know, sort of traditional boundaries of Germany. Well, they had territory in China. By the way, when that territory was relinquished in 1919, without talking to people in China, instead of giving it back to China, because China was in such upheaval and so weak, actually Japan was at that meeting and was able to negotiate that they got the German territory. This meant that many students, especially young people in the cities, the intellectuals, said, look, Japan is a threat, and now the Europeans end the war, right? The Japanese are there, and the Japanese have been able to get territory from China that used to belong to Germany. It should come to us. Well, see that. So they begin to protest, and what we ultimately see then is a great struggle in China in the aftermath of World War I. So we've seen in World War I, the aftermath in Europe are a bunch of fledgling nations. In Asia, we see that China is quite weak. And there's basically two ways which they might go. There are two parties or two groups that are fighting for control in China. One of them is a nationalistic party of Sun Yat-sen, the guy that we already talked about. And then the other, of course, the teachings of Karl Marx as interpreted by the Communist Chinese, or the Chinese Communist Party. Now, communism had been theorized by Karl Marx and promoted. Communist Manifesto and so forth. We've talked about him. And then we saw how Lenin was released by the Germans, transported to Russia to make trouble for the Russians, and basically how that ended up resulting in a revolution in Russia. So we went from having no communist countries, let's say in 1910, to communist Soviet Union by 1915-16. And now the Communist Party is growing in China. And we'll see that eventually will take over in the late 1940s. So the Communist Party in China begins in the early 20s. And it's usually just the initials CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. And who do they go for help? Well, they go see our buddy Lenin. He's the guy that's pulled it off. And we see that, so the Russians kind of get involved here. Obviously, they're communists, and the Chinese Communist Party. And so they help with money, supplies, advice. How can you do this? And of course, it's going to have to be a military takeover, which in fact it will be. But it will not be accomplished until after World War II. But all the things are being put into place here in this period following World War I. Okay? Well, let's do a couple more screens before we have to end it here. So we see then things will have another major change in 1925 when the leader of this movement, Sun, dies of cancer, and then that leaves this man, Chiang Kai-shek, in charge of this democratic movement in China. So increasingly, the communist forces under the leadership of Mao and the Republic forces under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek will fight for control over China. And this will become a political football for the West, especially the United States, when we finally have to enter World War II, and we're thinking that eventually, you know how the United States, how all countries make contingency plans. If Japan keeps growing in power, the United States figured at some point there would be conflict between Japan and the United States. If that happens, and when it did happen, increasingly China becomes very important, because China could be the staging ground for U.S. forces that would eventually make a landing in Japan. You know, because we didn't have enough territory out there for that to happen. So Chiang Kai-shek was really our ally. Our idea was we could build up our troops on mainland China, and then we could launch, sort of like we did with D-Day out of England, if you want to use that as a model, that England was a place we built up all of our troops and equipment, and then we did an amphibious assault across to France, that we were probably going to have to do the same kind of thing, you know, because we just didn't have enough Navy and didn't have enough support to do it that way. So build everything up in China, then launch a massive flotilla across to Japan. Well, eventually we didn't do that because we dropped nuclear bombs and they finally did surrender. But that was part of the plan. As that plan went out the window, so too the importance of China as an ally, and we kind of left, in some people's opinion, kind of left Chiang Kai-shek out on his own, and we didn't really support him when he needed help, and the communists take over China. So all this is happening in the world, in Europe and in Asia, There's huge changes following World War I. Well, we'll end it there.